What it do, anime crew? Hey man, listen, I just finished the Darjeeling Limited, which is a hour and a half long movie by Wes Anderson, as well as the prequel short, Hotel Chevalier, obviously by the same director. Was it Chevalier? Yeah, I think so. Um, so yeah, this was a really interesting movie. It's the second Wes Anderson movie I've seen. The first one being his directorial debut, Bottle Rocket, and there's a lot of the same motifs that prevailed throughout both of them. One of them is, of course, the characters being, very like a bunch of stooges, basically. Don't tell me I hear. Gosh. All right, I can already tell my cat's going to be a problem at some point in this rant because the second she heard me start ranting, she started walking into the room, which is going to be a whole thing, I'm sure. But yeah, a lot of the motifs persisted through. That of the stooge-like characters, a lot of, especially the symmetrical shot compositions I noticed like all throughout this movie, which is interesting because it's an extremely versatile and multifaceted like cinematic technique. Blah. I feel like most often in the way that Wes implements it, it's sort of a juxtaposition to highlight, like, a lot of these characters, they're clumsy, they're ungainly, they're slovenly, they're chaotic, they stick out like a sore thumb amidst a background that's otherwise so uniform and organized. It can also serve to center center and frame a character, of course. It can also add a slightly uncanny or surreal elements, as they did with one of the shots towards the end of the movie, which almost carried with it a more spiritual context and connotation. And one thing I want to mention about this movie is I bet it's probably really interesting if you know anything more about like Hinduism and like that sort of sphere of spirituality, because I don't, but for the very little I do know, it's basically just the entire extent of my knowledge basically starts and ends at like reincarnation. But I know that especially in a spiritual sense, it's not always necessarily taken so literally, or it doesn't necessarily have to be taught or understood so literally as people coming back to life. But just sort of the energy and influence that exists within you, causing a chain reaction and never stopping to affect people, and things constantly ending but then being born anew and having this sort of constant energy throughout that same human essence that we are all a part of. There's something within every single one of us that is the same, and in that sense, we're never truly pass away, but also our influence will forever live on, no matter how many chains of like disconnection there is. And it's definitely interesting from a Wes Anderson movie because, as I said, and when I was talking about Bottle Rocket, these characters are really stupid and they're very childlike. And while that movie was sort of about maintaining your childlike innocence into adulthood and making sure that your view of the world remains somewhat uncorrupted for the sake of your own sanity, basically. This one, or not that there's like a distinction. This one was a little bit more grounded, I would say, but I'll get to that in a second. It makes sense for there to be more of a spiritual through line because I always felt like there is some sort of guiding principle protecting these characters from certain doom. And, a lot of that can thematically be attributed to their innocence and their naivete and their generally, ultimately, good nature, despite the fact that they have a lot of silly, shortcomings and hang-ups. For example, these three characters, one of them is basically doesn't know what to do other than to directly emulate his clearly flawed father and his clearly flawed relationships. He mentions like he just imagines he's going to get divorced from his wife, even though she's like perfect for him, just because that's the only role model he had to look up to. You have one kid who's scrambling. He was probably hit the most emotionally by it, as kind of symbolized by his injuries that were eventually revealed to be self-inflicted, basically. And he's extremely defensive, and he wants to play the role of the older brother, and he's extremely hurt, and he wants to just help mitigate that damage. He wants to try to plan everything out. He tries to intellectualize everything. He tries to make sure that he has a plan for everything and total control over the situation to where things are all okay, not only for him, but more importantly for his younger siblings. Though it's, oftentimes to a little bit of a narcissistic or egotistical degree. And then you have the youngest, who is most concerned with basic hedonistic distraction, though he's also shown to be clinging to past relationships and things like that. He clearly uses people as something of an outlet because he is emotionally stunted. Maybe the timeline of their mother leaving was so that him as the youngest basically never knew his mother. You can only really speculate as to why he's emotionally stunted in the particular way that he is, but he's always constantly asking for approval for every decision he makes. One of the running gags, which I will say this movie is pretty funny, one of the running gags throughout the story is that he just very clearly recaps details of his life and interactions he's had and things he said and passes them off as a short story asking for approval from his brothers. And he always has to reiterate to them that these characters are, they're all fictional. It's not just my life or whatever, when, clearly it is. So he's sort of, in many ways, the most emotionally underdeveloped. And then the eldest brother is, the one trying to basically steer the ship. The middle brother is the one who is most directly emulating the father. So they all have their shortcomings. And they all have egos, and they all really don't get along that well. They're very individualistic. They're hesitant to sort of come together because none of them are, especially competent or trustworthy. There's a really funny scene towards the beginning I like where basically, and there's a couple of repetitions of similar motifs throughout this movie, but where they basically all have secrets that they say, all right, don't tell the other guy. And then they tell the other guy's like, all right, this guy is a secret, but don't tell him that I told you. And then, it gets to the third step. Hey, this guy told me that you told me the secret, but don't tell him I told you, and it's just funny, like, how fast the rumor wheel spins because of just, like, how untrustworthy these guys are. It really sells that, which is interesting because the ultimate catharsis of the movie is when they trust each other and when they become closer as a family, which, is sort of ultimately initially catalyzed by the death of a kid that they basically tried to save. Their father's death was one thing, and it was obviously extremely emotionally scarring to the point where they've all developed these various avoidant behaviors regarding the grief of it all, and they're trying to recover from that grief. But also, it's different when it's basically like the younger generation. There's some kid that dies, basically, and if nothing else, it reminds the one who's having a kid and having all these immature delusions of like divorce and stuff. It basically forces him to like lock in and realize that he's transitioning into a point in his life where he has to be a caretaker, or he has to make sure that other people are okay, or he has to take life into his own hands for the sake of others. Which is sort of a little bit of a distinction I found between that and Bottle Rocket, which was a little bit more foundational in its thematic like messaging. In terms of like preserving that naivete. This one's a little bit more nuanced, I guess, in a sense of still growing and still becoming a provider and becoming a role model and maturing. But ultimately, the second moment of catharsis was ironically in a way that sort of helps resolve the eldest brother's character arc, unspoken. It was with the best, most cinematically ambitious shot in the entire movie. With all the people connected on the train, as I said before, with those spiritual connotations of interconnectedness, of influence, of shared experience, of the cycle of life and humanity as the train goes around, across the tracks in a cyclical manner. And then, of course, to signify the emotional arcs being completed, they eventually abandon all their baggage so that they can run and chase the train of life once more at the end of the movie, as a parallel to the very beginning with the businessman who I guess might have represented the father. I'm not totally sure, because I find that interesting because, I don't know. This movie probably has a lot of rewatch value, and there's also probably a lot of insight that you could glean from it if you were more knowledgeable about Hindu like spirituality. But it's interesting because the way that I was going to say that the second emotional catharsis resolves the eldest brother's character arc is that he is trying to plan everything. He's trying to intellectualize everything. He is trying to have all of these spiritual epiphanies and is going out of his way to calculate, every little detail, even if he's not actually, bright enough to do that. That's sort of his intent, and that's what he's trying to do. He's trying to maintain control of the situation. But it ends up just being that, grief is one of those things where it's very difficult to come to a logical conclusion about how best to deal with it. you sort of just have to feel out the emotions, be with people you love, be with people you trust, and think about the future and all the things that are yet to come and all the beautiful things still left in the world. It's not something that you have to sit there and think about and intellectualize. It's more so a feeling. It's emotional baggage that you eventually sort of have to shake off, which was yeah, I really enjoyed that. But yeah, the central metaphor of the train was persistent throughout the entire film. One of my favorite things that's persistent throughout the entire film is just the dialogue, because the dialogue always goes into the characterization of all three of these guys, basically. Even when they have like these, I don't know what you would call them, not offerings, but they have these like peacock feathers that have some sort of spiritual purpose, and they all use them in the wrong way, but the way that they use them in the wrong way is indicative of their individual personalities. Like the one who is the most avoidant and constantly going after women and stuff like that, for like a temporary distraction, hedonistic pleasure and all that, he throws his away into the wind, essentially like, averting his eyes from it in a metaphorical sense. And then the other guy, what does he do? He holds on to it. And doesn't actually dispose of it, doesn't actually move on, doesn't do anything because, he's mimicking the father in the most literal sense. And you have all these little intricacies, like with the way. It's so funny how much my cat needs my attention every time I start talking. Really, every single rant at this point, every single rant, no matter where she is in the house, she'll come over to me and start jumping on my head and bothering me. But yeah, literally every single little interaction is painted by their personalities. A lot of it really is quite funny. The set design was really interesting. As I said, I mean, absolute so many symmetrical or pseudo-symmetrical shot compositions. You had use of slow motion. You had use of, at one point, that sort of surrealist imagery. I also like, the tiger. I'm just realizing this now. The symbolism of the tiger at the end of that shot with all the train cars. I guess the tiger kind of representing the end of the line and death in general, which could then be applied to the mother's character, who was sort of absent for a lot of the boys' lives and constantly leaving them, and could probably directly explain a lot of the personality, psychological hang-ups and personality traits that the boys developed. But the reason that she is away at the time is because she's dealing with a tiger, which probably might be her own hang-ups with the concept of the fact that she might be aging and getting to the point where she could die soon. Maybe that's why she seems to have just like more effectively averted her attention away from the loss of the boy's father, because she found like a little bit more of a spiritually enlightening and involving and demanding purpose, something a little bit religious. That's probably a much more effective and less hollow way of sort of distracting yourself from the grief, even though it's still ultimately probably not the best thing you can do for your own mental health and for the sake of moving on. But yeah, I guess that does probably have something to do with her own proximity to death, and in that sense you could probably read into her character like that. I'll be excited to talk to Aesop about this one, but I would say those are my most of my initial thoughts. It was a really solid movie. There were a couple of standout tracks from the OST that I really liked. I would say my favorite parts, a lot of them were towards the end. Of course, that shot of the all the train cars, all the different people throughout the movie that were influenced. A lot of times it is really such. And for me personally, I watched this movie. I started the movie twice basically, and then I watched it a third time because we don't have to get into why. It has nothing to do with the movie though, just for like entirely personal reasons. And so it really is just like a nice trip down memory lane. Like every single thing that's happened really puts into perspective all the lives that these people have influenced, all the heartbreak and loss and growth, and all these amazing things that have happened. The true full scope of life. Just sitting there, appreciating it, taking it in a sense that doesn't necessarily need to be intellectualized, isn't necessarily directly reflected like in the character arcs or like the text of the story or anything, but just sort of highlights Wes Anderson's filmmaking prowess and ability to elicit very special, unique, and healing emotions. So yeah, this was a great movie. Maybe even better than Bottle Rocket. I'm not sure. We'll see. I'll have to see how I feel about it. I'll sit on it for a few more days. But yeah, I really enjoyed this one. Anime signing off.